What is an art form? If you were to take the literal definition from Merriam-Webster, it would define it in several ways. The first being a medium recognized as fine art, the second being a medium regarded as artistic in some way, and the third being an enhanced level of skill being shown at an activity. But art is not only about performing an activity or creating something, it could also be about feedback. Not necessarily feedback from the consumer of the art, but the feedback the art itself produces. A painting may create the feedback of making you happy using bright colors or sad using darker ones. A composer may gradually increase the tempo for a few measures to build up to the climax of something. A writer might use very descriptive words to get the reader to imagine an environment that's of importance. Video games are kind of a whirlwind of, but definitely not limited to, all three of these. This whirlwind of tasks stretches over a wide variety of things that would need to be done when creating a video game, from creating an art style and adding a color palette, to adding some lighting and creating the general mood of the video game, adding sound effects or background music, getting some player controls in, adding a narrative or anticipation for player input. There is a laundry list of things that goes on behind creating a video game, and it would make sense as to why sometimes you'd see a big team creating such a simple game, because it's not simple at all. And there's a whole lot that needs to be done. It's easy to look at parts of a game in a generalized way and think of how simple they are as a whole without breaking them down and seeing how many different little things go into making that one part. The first thing a player will criticize before they've even had a chance to fully experience the game are animations, art direction and style, and maybe color palette. They're looking for certain things like, is the environment bright? Is it dark and grimy? Are there shadows? Or does the lighting cover everything? Is it pixel art, ray traced? Or is there a stylized version in between? Art is kind of the eye candy, and the player definitely has a sweet tooth. The art necessarily doesn't mean that the game has to look ultra realistic, it just needs to flow well. There needs to be consistency and cohesion between what's going on the screen. From the character animations, to the movement of the environment, to the visual effects that most players tend to be completely unaware of until it's not there. Seriously, the next time you play a game, try to spot the little visual things, like particles being kicked up when you run, leaves falling from the trees in the background, or the menu buttons changing textures when you hover or click on them. Noticing these little things is kind of like the pleasant opposite of noticing a tile being ever so crooked in the wall, or a floorboard coming loose, or the Windows cursor being ever so slightly misaligned. But no matter what kind of art style or visual effects you choose, they all need to be tied together by one thing, your color palette, and some kind of basic color theory, just in order to be able to keep the game consistent and satisfying. You have to kind of understand that mixing bright red with lime green just doesn't look appealing. And if you're using all dark colors, you have to be aware that adding brighter colors will either make something stick out like a sore thumb, or make it stick out like a star on a Christmas tree. And that's why the visuals of a game are so difficult to manage, because it's all about where you want the player to look and how you want the player to feel with the environment. And using that collection of visual elements, you are able to do that. You just have to make sure you're keeping track of all of the elements that you may continually add to a scene to build it up. Storytelling and art tend to go hand in hand, because the easiest way to tell someone a story in the quickest time possible is just to paint them a picture. After all, one of those is worth 1,000 words, so imagine what you could do with 60 of them in a second. Higher quality graphics games can use smaller, more human-like facial features to easily display emotions and thoughts, whereas a graphically lower-end game may need to exaggerate its environment and the character's facial features and body language to really get a point across. A story will also dictate the importance of an event in a game and how far along the player is to completing a game, which is why proper pacing is important. If a story starts out with a great exposition, but tends to teeter off towards the middle and towards the end, you're going to lose the player's interest. It's not going to seem like an interesting story anymore, and even though you may have some of the most compellingly written characters, the story pacing is just not there to back it up. A balance needs to be struck between giving the player enough story to keep them entertained, but not so much as it overwhelms them all at once. But there are other ways to tell a story, like environmental storytelling. When looking at environmental storytelling, there are several questions that need to be answered. If you're placing something to tell it in an environment, you need to maybe explain how it got there. What is it telling? Is it even important for the player to look at? You could also hit the player with a wall of text, but maybe it's a horror game, and an incoherent scratching on the wall may do the exact same job, and prevent the player from being bored of trying to read an entire paragraph. After all, they're there to play a video game, not read a light novel. Unless, of course, the game is a visual novel, which then wall of text is what you want. You just have to figure out how to convey the story through the words, and less through the environment or sprite movement with the character animations. The next part is probably what most people think about when they hear the words game development. They think programming, variables, classes, staying up way too late to finish something you're working on, or drinking way too much caffeine to get through it. But even though many people think of programming when they hear the words game development, it doesn't actively come to your mind when you see a character jump. You don't think, there's vector math being used. You think, that's a pretty animation for when the character is jumping. And that's what good programming is. It's programming that works in a way that the player doesn't even think about it working. There is no in-between with programming. It either works or it doesn't. Some people may say the program doesn't do what I tell it to, but that's really just the program doing exactly what you tell it to. You just don't know how to tell it what you want it to do. But back to the point of good programming being unnoticeable. It could be the little things like a loading or transition screen, the slider to adjust the field of view in your settings, choosing a dialogue option, or even registering a QuickTime event. All of these take programming, and good programming doesn't get in the way of the art, the sound, or what's happening on the screen. If a character's jump feels off, it's straight to the code to figure out a way to make it not feel off and work with the animations. And that's what's so tricky about programming a game, because you're not creating a calculator where you know that if the variable of x equals 2 and the variable of y equals 3, that their outcome will be 5. You have to keep constantly adjusting and tweaking things until it feels like the game is fluid and it's not noticeable to the player that something is out of line. Now, you could argue that the animations are supposed to make things feel fluid, but if you have the most perfect animation in the world, but you miss time when the animation is played in the code, it won't feel right. And that's why, at least for me, the word programming can sometimes be interchangeable with trial and error or check the documentation. Sound design can be in the same boat as visual effects, where if you're completely immersed in a game, you may not even notice the little patter sounds that your character makes when he runs on the grass, or the collecting sound that the coin makes when you pick it up. But sound design goes far beyond little sound effects. It's background music and soundtracks. How loud should they be? When should they be played? Should you even have background music? Does it match the theme and the art style and the color palette we're going for? Does it get the player to feel what we want them to feel? And just like with the visual effects, you may not notice that it's there until it's gone. And that's why sound design can be so difficult, because you want it to be noticeable enough, but not so noticeable to the point where that's all that the player can think about. You want the menu buttons to have a little clicking sound, but you don't want the clicking sound to be so loud that it overpowers everything else. You want the violins in the background to be loud enough where you can match them with the art and the environment, but you don't want them to be so loud that all the player can hear is just the violins and they can't see anything else. Admittedly, sound design is the part of game development that I have the least idea about, despite spending 4 years in a band class. And I think that's just because playing music from a sheet is very different than composing the music yourself and trying to make it match everything in an environment that you've created. You need to be aware of the tempo and what key changes you're using and how long will the song be before it repeats, and will it sound good if it repeats. There's a lot that goes into sound design, and like every other little thing in a video game, you tend to not notice it if it's done well. And I believe that's the premise of good game design. Do all the little things so well and make them so unnoticeable that all the player can think about is playing the game and not what makes it up. So the reason that nobody thinks about the small things in a good game is because they don't have to. You don't have to worry about the vector math when a character is jumping because the jump feels nice. You don't have to worry about how many frames an animation has because the animation's fluid. You don't have to worry about the tempo of the background music because it just feels immersive to be in. You don't have to worry about the pacing of the story because you'll experience it eventually. And all of this brings us back to the point of what art is. In the same way that you wouldn't notice a painter's individual brushstrokes or a musician's individual notes, a good video game will keep you immersed to the point where you may not immediately notice the little things. But no matter the size of the game, from the small 2D field of view of Pong to the massive open world of Elden Ring, what keeps video games all tied together is the fact that they're all composed of the little things. And it's the little things that make it an art form.